As regular viewers will know, I recently published a three-part series responding blow by blow to Climate the Movie. The intention was to review the claims it made, scientific and political, to respond to whether the claims were true, if there was a point of dispute, were they nevertheless fair comment, or were they just false. It's fair to say I was not impressed with what I saw overall, although there were a few points of agreement in the politics section. Indeed, I went so far as to summarise the science part as garbage science. So what could be more bracing than following that up with a discussion with Tom Nelson, who was the producer of Climate the Movie. Tom was good enough to comment under one of the videos. I suggested that we then do this session, and he promptly agreed. We approached this with a view to exploring and discussing positions, not a formal debate, but an attempt to have a constructive but no doubt pointed discussion. Constructive it was, pointed at times it certainly was, and we agreed to post the discussion unedited on both his and my channels. And here it is. Tom Nelson, as I said, was producer of Climate the Movie. He runs a very active podcast on his channel, talking to all people who are convinced that human-caused climate change is not a thing. You can find links to his channel in the video description below. It's long, so without further ado, let's jump straight in. Welcome to this interesting experiment. My name is Mallen Baker. I'm a YouTube, and I'm in discussion with Tom Nelson, also on YouTube. And it follows the Climate the Movie piece of content that Tom was the producer for, and that I did a three-part review of on my channel, which I think it's fair to say was a critical review, but also really to do with that whole dialogue in relation to climate change, to the science, to the politics, and all of that, where I think we have a lot of interesting diverging views. And following my review of Climate the Movie, Tom commented in the video description of one of those videos, and I suggested that we actually have this discussion because I looked at his channel and it was an echo chamber, as these things always are, because that's what YouTube encourages. My channel is not an echo chamber because of my unique superpower of pissing off both sides. But nevertheless, you know, you get people who are very much firmly dug into their own trenches. So a different kind of discussion, but it's not a debate, but one where we looked at where we agree and try to explore the reasons as to why we disagree on some of the other things. We thought it might be a productive and useful thing to do. Is that a fair introduction, Tom? Are you happy?
It is, yeah. Yeah, let's put a pin in that echo chamber thing for now, because I want to talk about that. But should we start with some points that we do agree on? I think that would be good to agree on something, like maybe on Extinction Rebellion. I have listened to you talking about Extinction Rebellion. It sounds like you're not a big fan of them. Am I correct there?
I think it's fair to say I have been more critical of Extinction Rebellion on my channel than I have been of your side, although I've been, yeah, let's be clear, I've been very critical of both, largely because from the founding of Extinction Rebellion, you had a group of people who were left-wing extreme activists who decided, and this is all, you know, their narrative, they have put this into the public domain. They looked for an issue that they believed they could mobilize the masses around to overthrow the government. And they elected on climate change because they believed that that would be something they could utilize to that end. And then if you look at the messaging that group did, certainly in those early days when that group was very firmly in charge, it was all very much in line with what you would have to do in order to make that happen. And so they set about quite deliberately the extreme doomist messaging, particularly aimed at young people with a view to recruiting them, having terrified them, in order to do extreme campaigning. In other words, go to prison in the name of the cause. And I look at that, and I don't necessarily think the people who did it are evil, because I don't generally spend a lot of time labeling people, and I give people the benefit of the doubt. But that as an action is the only thing on my channel I have labeled as an evil action, deliberately scaring children to recruit them to go to prison in the name of your cause. I don't think it gets worse than that. Obviously it can get worse than that, but within the sort of political discourse that we're talking about. So yes, I suspect we agree reasonably on that side.
Okay, so we agree we should not scare children about this because I think it is evil that if kids are not sleeping at night because they're afraid for their future, or if they're not studying because they're thinking, what's the point? I don't have a future anyway. We both agree that is evil to scare kids like that, correct?
Yes, I think there's a gray area where when you have scary things in the world, exactly how you do and don't communicate that to the youth of the time. I became an activist many, many, many years ago. I stopped being an activist some time ago, but I became an activist in the early 80s when it seemed highly likely that we might enter an all-out nuclear war. We were genuinely on a hair trigger, and it felt like we were on a hair trigger. So, of course, lots of people were out on the street and protesting. I was a young person at the time looking at all of that. And of course, it was impossible to insulate young people from the reality that we were in quite a difficult situation. Now, there is still a question mark about how you communicate the real issues that the adult world is facing and engaging with in a way that isn't designed to make it worse, isn't designed to terrify them. And yes, if you look at the evidence on climate change, the way that the majority of people understand it, we'll have that discussion, of course, in due course, then it's unbelievable that you wouldn't have to communicate something about that to the young people who are learning about the world. But there is a difference between education and then about explaining about an issue and actually going out of your way to put terror into people as a campaigning tactic. And so whilst recognizing, yes, of course, there's a gray area there, we might disagree about where that is and how one deals with that. Clearly, Extinction Rebellion sat well over that line and did so deliberately.
Yeah, and how about this whole idea of blocking traffic or gluing yourself to stuff or smashing glass on the Magna Carta or all this other stuff, throwing soup on paintings? Are you in favor of any of that, or what do you think?
So there's two ways of looking at that. One is from a nuisance perspective, which is obviously how most people look at it. But then having been a campaigner many, many years ago, you can also look at it and say, well, does this make sense as a campaign strategy, a campaign tactic? And it falls on that front as well, because if you are trying to win an argument, if you are trying to win a campaign, you're presumably seeking to persuade people to your point of view. That is a remarkably counterproductive approach to doing it. Now, of course, it wasn't counterproductive necessarily for the people who founded XR, because what they wanted to do was to create conflict with a view to bringing down the government. What they didn't want to do necessarily was to persuade a bunch of people about climate change. In fact, when they started, if you did a poll on what people thought about climate change, you wouldn't have found an awful lot of persuading to be done. The majority of people accepted that it was a problem. But by making themselves more controversial and more of a nuisance, if anything, they fed your backlash and raised questions in the minds of ordinary people to say, well, these people look strange, they dress weird, they behave oddly, and they disrupt people like me. Am I going to believe what they tell me about the world, about what we should do about the world? Well, I'm probably not going to. This is why politicians who are seeking to persuade people try to get as few barriers between them and the people they're seeking to persuade as they can, because we trust people who are like us, but they go out their way to look unlike everyone else. And there's some rationale in their heads as to why they do that. But if you're looking at it from a purely campaign strategy, no, it's bonkers. It doesn't work at all. And yet, once people are dug in their trenches, very rarely will you see that self-questioning that acknowledges when something that you've been doing doesn't work. That is a charge I'd place on your side as well, but it's a very, yeah. I will occasionally make comparisons between what they do and what your side does, but it's almost always takes a very different form when I do that.
Okay. Another point of agreement I think I found between you and I is that the whole targets, the like a guardrail of 1.5 C over pre-industrial or 2.0 C, the whole idea of those guardrails, or I don't know if you believe in tipping points at those exact guardrail spots. What do you think?
This is really just the difference between looking at what the mainstream climate science community is saying and then the way that it's being talked about politically and within the media and with a few campaigning scientists. So the majority say that there is no cliff edge where you wander over 1.5 or 1.502 or whatever, and then suddenly you're into this cascading consequence scale. 1.5 is better than 1.6, 1.6 is better than 1.7, but there's no cliff edge. That's what I understand the scientific community says and the research that I've reviewed says. Now, of course, when they were coming up with the Paris climate targets, they wanted a target. And there was a rationale for why 1.5, because there are expected to be consequences every step further that you go. So it wasn't that it was completely irrational, but then the way it was communicated started to portray it as the cliff edge number. And of course, you can spot this well in advance, because if you're saying 1.5 is one cliff edge and 2.0 is another cliff edge, you and I can easily spot that those are suspiciously round numbers. And the preference for round numbers, of course, is a human thing, not really a law of physics in any way, shape, or form. So it doesn't necessarily help the rational discussion of these to fixate on a particular target. At the same time, of course, saying that can be used as an excuse for doing nothing, for saying, well, if 1.5 isn't a problem, then 1.6 isn't a problem, then 1.7 isn't a problem, then 3.10 isn't a problem. I understand why people want to put pressure as a campaigning device, if you want, why people want to put pressure that pushes in the direction that they see as essential. And a lot of what your side does and a lot of the other side does are all entirely understandable campaign techniques based on the positions that people are in and what their objectives are. So it wasn't any rational thing to do from a campaign objective, but I think it had unintended consequences in terms of adding to the fear that people have with now the vision in their head of this cliff face, that the minute we go over that, then everything is gone, we're doomed. And this fed into, of course, there's 10 months to save the world or 2 years to save the planet type stuff. Arguably, what they were talking about was if we didn't take action within that time, we would go over that cliff edge. And that was right. Clearly now, most people are concluding we've now reached the point where it's too late to stay within 1.5. Where they were wrong wasn't that consequence. It was like saying once you're over 1.5, then that's it. It's too late to save the planet. And that, of course, is just nonsense. That was a highly ill-advised campaign message. But this is what people do.
So yeah, just as an aside there, in the ClimateGate emails, Phil Jones said the 2.C degree limit was, quote, plucked out of thin air. He admitted that privately, and I think we agree that that probably was kind of plucked, that there's nothing magical about 2.0. But I would like to talk about a little later whether we know that a little bit of warming from here is actually bad for us. Like 1.6 is worse than 1.5, but let's put a pin in that one for now. What else can we agree on before we start going on to the disagreement parts? Do you think, do you think people are willing to take a downgrade in their lifestyles in order to fight this? They think the problem is that big that they're willing to give up some of their money and freedom in order to try to prevent bad weather in the future?
Well, let's step back from that, because I would say that the starting distinction that I think we can probably agree on in theory, although it doesn't always translate in how we talk about it in practice, is that there's a distinction between the science of climate and the science of what is happening in the climate and why, and the politics of the question of what we should do about it. And they are two completely different things, but the way that they are often talked about, they are wrapped up together. So that if you believe that the planet is warming because you look at the evidence and that's what it seems to suggest, then as far as some people are concerned, that alone makes you a communist, which is ridiculous.
Oh, wait a minute.
It is absurd. I suspect we could, let's just see if we can agree on this one, Tom. I think it is a real tell that if you believe that the climate is warming because of human-caused climate change in the United States, you can usually tell someone's politics as a result of whether they believe that scientific proposition. And I would have thought that you and I would accept, but tell me if I'm wrong, that that is a tell that how we are deciding on this issue has got nothing to do with science. Because there is no way that belief in a scientific proposition should fall along party political lines.
Yeah, for a lot of people, that is the case. For me, absolutely not. I started out believing in this thing until I looked at the evidence. So evidently my ideology or whatever did not prevent me from believing it. I did believe until I looked at the evidence. I don't know about how did this go for you? Did you ever have a time when you didn't believe, or you looked at the evidence and then you did, or how did it go for you?
I started generally accepting what the scientific headlines had been when I started a YouTube channel, and I decided to try and project it into the space where, you know, to avoid creating that sort of echo chamber. I started doing reviews of what were the best arguments pushing against climate change, because I attracted a mixed audience, but some of whom were skeptical. They were interested in my channel because I treated them with respect and listened to what they had to say, which wasn't an experience they necessarily found in many other places. And so I started doing videos about, okay, what are the best arguments against? And I would review them. And very quickly, I thought, well, there's no point in doing this unless you review it with an open mind and you look at the evidence and look at what it says. And there were certain topics that I ended up looking at where the skeptical view got the win. I mean, I did one on polar bears and was scathing about the scientists who did a peer-reviewed paper, which was basically set up to do an ad hominem attack on Susan Crockford. You know, that was one where the evidence behind what was being claimed and when and by whom, you know, largely supported the position that your side has championed. And so that's what I said, because I was looking to the evidence and that's what the evidence said. And there were various other areas where, you know, I went into topics that people on, I don't want to keep using the phrase your side, but there are two sides and you are firmly associated with one. So I don't mean anything disparaging when I say that. But so, for instance, during lockdown, I was certainly covering content that was lockdown skeptical. And you could look at that at the time and say, well, at the moment, we're only paying attention to one variable here, which is deaths from COVID, as opposed to all the other variables that lead to human well-being. And that at the time was relatively a controversial position to take. The same with during COVID, looking at the lab leak theory, which I started talking about and saying, well, this seems to be a viable proposition at a time when it was still held to be a conspiracy theory. So my willingness to go into topics that some people dismiss as conspiracy theory, some people are viscerally against, and say, well, does the evidence support this? I think I've relatively shown, whenever I've looked at core climate issues and critiques, I've only ever come up with a sense that the mainstream research is relatively robust and the criticisms against it, one or two have been interesting and many of them have been poor. And so that's what I've concluded. Now, I may be right, I may be wrong, but that is consistently my yardstick. I try and define my identity around someone who's fascinated in what's true, because on that basis, if new information comes to light that challenges something I previously believed, I'm excited about that. And I will say, bring it on. Let's see this. This is interesting. I'm interested in gray areas, and I generally don't express opinions unless I think the evidence is there. So I said the lockdown theory, the lab leak theory was viable. I never said that it was proven, because the evidence hasn't proven one way or the other. But nevertheless, sometimes just saying that it's viable is controversial enough. So anyway, that's my rather long-winded answer to your simple question. The more I looked at the climate change issues on a piece-by-piece basis, examining the various critiques of them, the more I felt the core science seemed to stand up, and the majority of the skeptic argument seemed to be based on often misrepresentations. And that then makes you more and more suspicious of, when something new comes up. If it comes from the same stable, you say, well, I suppose I'll look at that now, but I'm not holding out much hope, because if they could line up alongside this other stuff, then I don't take them as reliable narrators. And you get some sense of this, of people who, whenever you check the references, when they're always solid, you start to trust them, and you might not check the references quite so often. But when you've checked it a couple of times and they were wrong, then you start to think, okay, every time they put something forward now, I am more skeptical. And I'm afraid that's where I've been with your side. If you could give me some golden pitch that explained what we see in the real world better than the mainstream view of that, then I would be excited by that. I would look at that with all seriousness. But I have to say, what you've given me so far hasn't done it for me.
Fantastic. I can't wait to dig into the details of that stuff you said. But I want to back up and talk about this whole echo chamber thing, that you see my channel as an echo chamber and yours as not. But I'm wondering how many climate realists like me have appeared long form on your channel? Because I have had Jeff Price appeared, Gerald Kootenai a couple of times. And then I've invited Michael Mann and Gavin Schmidt. I've invited tens of people from the other side to be on there and lay out their case, but they won't do it. For whatever reason, they won't be on my podcast. I would have tons of people from what we're calling your side, but they don't want to do it.
No. You see,
what do you mean? No.
I am not on a side.
You see me as on a side, but you're not on a side.
That's right, because we've just been sharing our mutual dislike of what Extinction Rebellion do. They are on the other side. And you see, this is one of the challenges to you, Tom, on all of this, because the way that you talk about so-called climate alarmists roves almost without exception from people in the mainstream of climate science who are just doing a piece of work on what's happening in the Antarctic, all the way through to Roger Hallam and Extinction Rebellion and all of that, as though this is all one amorphous mass.
Hold on. Who exactly are you talking about when you say your side? Who exactly are you talking about?
I don't talk about. So when I say about your side, is that your question?
That's my question, yes. Are you specifying who is my side exactly? What do they believe?
So your side, one thing that you need to understand about both sides is that whenever you're on a side, you see the nuances in your own whilst not seeing the nuances in the other. So your side is just as nuanced as the other side. But so you've got people on your side who believe that the planet isn't warming at all the way through to, I guess, Bjorn Lomborg, who says yes, the planet is warming, but it's not as big a problem as people say, and we should be asking more intelligent questions about what's the most appropriate policies to be following. Now, arguably, all of those are on one side in that they are opposing action on climate change today. You could make that distinction, but of course, there's a world of difference between a Bjorn Lomborg and a Tony Heller and all of these different characters. And in many ways, one of the things that I wanted to ask of you, because in terms of understanding what we agree on, as far as I could tell from Climate the movie, there were at least 3 and maybe 4 distinct propositions of what might be happening instead of human-caused climate change. That it's not happening at all, or that it's only happening.
No. That was not in the movie. Nope, that's your misinterpretation of the movie. There's nothing in the movie saying that the Earth has not warmed since 1850 or since 1975.
Okay.
I don't know any skeptic who does not believe that the Earth has warmed. I'm sure those people are out there. But it's very common on my side. Of course, during the Little Ice Age, it was colder. Of course, during the global cooling scare in the 70s, it was colder. It has warmed since then. It has also cooled since other points in the past.
Okay, so showing graphs and saying this, here's the Central England graph, and it shows practically no warming, and
it shows some warming. It shows some warming.
And here's Central Park, New York, which shows no particular warming
since the 1940s.
It gives an impression, but okay, fine. Nope. So you're clear that's not intentional.
No,
that's fine.
It's not. We didn't say it.
But then you've got other versions, which is about yes, there's warming, but it's mostly to do with the urban heat island effects.
We didn't say mostly. Maybe half. We said maybe half. When you were doing your debunking, we said it was because of urban heat island, but we never said it's all of it. But some of it is because of the urban heat island effect. Yes, some, not all.
Okay, then you've got cosmic rays forming clouds, and then you've got solar effects. And to some extent, you then start to ask yourself, well, hang on a moment, what do you believe? So I'm interested, Tom, if we accept that the planet is warming, and there were several different explanations that came through the movie.
Correct.
What do you personally believe?
I believe climate. Yeah, I believe Earth's climate is incredibly complex. I think no one knows exactly what caused the Minoan warm period and the Roman warm period. What caused the medieval warm period, Little Ice Age? We know it fluctuated a lot. We know even in the 20th century, it fluctuated a lot. And we have ideas. Cosmic rays may be part of it. There's all sorts of ideas, but we don't know. It's not one thing. It's incredibly complex, and nobody on either side, or whatever you want to call it, we don't understand it. But what we do know is that CO2 isn't the climate control knob. It's not the climate control knob. And the Earth isn't too warm. There's no evidence to support that the weather is getting worse. Pretty much, I mean, everything that you hear that is alarming about the climate, there's not evidence to support it. The climate is just fine. And the whole idea that warming from here is going to make our life worse, there's no evidence for that either. Warm periods have always been better for humans and life on Earth than cold periods. So the whole idea that if it warms another 2/10 from here, my life is going to get worse, or life in general for the average person, that's going to get worse, the evidence does not support that.
So I'm interested that you slipped from talking about what's causing warming to then some of these other questions, because
okay, but I'm saying we don't know what caused it. We don't know what caused the warming since 1975. You don't know. We don't know.
How is it? I'm interested in this. How is it that you are so uncertain about all of these various factors that are flowing around? You're so uncertain about, therefore, what's creating warming. And yet the one point of certainty that you're definitely signed up to is that it can't be human caused.
It can't.
All of these other things are uncertain, but this one you're certain about. Why?
Yeah, we are certain about this one because the correlation between CO2 and Earth's temperatures is not there at all. As we look at it, even in the 20th century, your hypothesis is that more CO2 means warmer temperatures. That's the hypothesis, and it's not borne out at all. And you can look back as far as you want at any time scale, and CO2 has never been the climate control knob. So that one thing we do know. We don't know what caused all these fluctuations, but the whole idea that if we know how much CO2 is in the air, we know how warm the Earth is. No, we don't. We have enormous amounts of evidence that is not what's happening, that it's not CO2 as the climate control knob. It is a factor. It's one of many, many factors. But the whole idea that we know what's going to happen, that it's going to warm between now and 2100, if CO2 goes up, we know the temperatures are going to go up. We don't know that. You and I might, people alive right now might easily see 30 years of cooling, even though CO2 goes up, because all sorts of things are happening that we don't understand. We can't predict it.
Do you think that sometimes the language that we use on all of this makes nuanced discussion harder? Because you've introduced this phrase of CO2 as being the control knob, which is not a phrase that I had used.
Yep.
And of course, that phrase implies that it is the sole factor, but it's the only thing that affects climate, which no climate scientist that I've read in terms of any research has ever claimed. One climate scientist used the phrase the CO2 being the control knob of the climate when explaining something to people in one publication. But nevertheless, I get the sense that I have to keep using the thing, your side. Right. I don't mean it to sound like the way that it does. I can't quite think of an alternative way of doing it. But your side is kind of fixated on this phrase.
Okay, hold on here. Just let me say one thing here. I'm looking at a paper right now in Science. It's written by Gavin Schmidt and Lasis, and the title of this paper is Atmospheric CO2, Principle, Control Knob,
No, that's right.
Temperature.
It was Schmidt's paper that used that phrase as an analogy to try and absolutely. Schmidt absolutely introduced that phrase into the discussion, but then it takes on a life of its own. What was intended to be an analogy, a way of explaining to people, presumably non-specialist people, ultimately suddenly becomes unhelpful because the implications of it get taken where it wasn't intended.
But don't you think a lot of politicians, kids, etc., absolutely believe this, that it is the principal control knob, and that's why they're devoting their life to fighting CO2, because they think that that's what's happening? But we're both agreeing that's not the truth.
So what we're not allowing here is the nuance of being able to say the thing that is out of balance at the moment is that, yes, humans are adding one element into the atmosphere, CO2, which is pushing what was previously relatively in balance, the carbon cycle relatively in balance, is pushing it out of balance. In that sense, it becomes the critical factor. Now, I think one can recognize that without demonizing a single element.
But how is it
nevertheless, that is the problem that we have to solve.
I'm sorry, how is it out of balance? Because for most of the last 600 million years, there's been way more CO2 there than now. How is it out of balance? We're way closer to the low point of that time than the high point of that time. We had thousands of ppm CO2, and very rarely have we had as little CO2 out there as we have right now. So this whole idea, it's out of balance and there's something bad going on because there's too much CO2, or the atmosphere is filling with CO2. You don't believe that, do you?
So what you're doing is you're taking something that happens on a geological time frame, for which we've seen over the course of the planet a certain number of consequences, because even on geological timeframes, sometimes when things change, you get things like mass extinctions and so on. So it's not as though there are never consequences on that time frame, but nevertheless, what happens on a geological time frame, and then what's happening within a human lifetime time frame, because it's not so much the question of what is the right CO2 level for the planet, what is the right temperature for the planet. Over geological timeframes, life, of course, adapts to fit whatever the conditions are that it has. But within human timeframes, of course, that doesn't necessarily happen. Back in 1974, Kissinger made speeches, which I referred to in my review of the movie in the third part, where they had started to see evidence within the US government and administration about the potential of climate change. And they realized that if you look back on human history, even the climate changes that have happened on relatively regional bases and relatively shorter timescales have wreaked havoc amongst human populations from time to time. And that nevertheless, we'd had a period where we had had a relatively stable climate, during which the population had burgeoned to billions, during which time we had created breadbasket agriculture systems to support that population, and the realization that we might therefore be vulnerable to even just a standard change in climate, such as humanity had seen in the past. And so they were talking about, we need to invest in climate science so that we can understand what's heading towards us, which is a good risk-based approach. You know, we may be vulnerable to problems here. There may be things down the pipeline we need to know. And that fed into the development of climate science, not Al Gore, by the way, which is what you said in your movie, but we can have that conversation.
Did we say that? Let's go back to what the CIA said in 1974 about climate. Quote, they said, the warmer climate we have enjoyed in recent decades was extremely favorable for agriculture. The climate of the 1800s was far less favorable to agriculture in most areas of the world. Extensive monsoon failures were common around the world, end quote, when it was cold. So this whole idea that we've always known that warm is bad for humans, again, it's wrong. We were worried about cooling because it was cooling in the 70s. So what do you think is the worst thing that has happened to humans? The worst thing because of the warming since like 1975?
Well, let me respond to your central point before I sort of rise to the bait of your question. Because that is a baiting question, but nevertheless, the point isn't some. Let's hold on to the nuance. The point isn't good equals warm, bad equals cold. The point is that change happens on a complex set of environments where we have some places in the world at the moment where they already experience warm periods that are on the edge of human tolerance.
But there are places where there's cold periods, right?
Absolutely,
cold kills
absolutely.
a lot more people than heat. So why are we worried about just where it's too warm? Why aren't we worried about where it's too cold?
Absolutely. So therefore, let's get away from stupid black versus white, warm equals good, cold equals bad equations, and talk about more seriously, what are the consequences of change and how do they play out?
Wait a minute, are you saying it's
they
stupid?
play
Wait a
out
minute,
differently. They play out differently depending where you are in the world. As you know full well, because this is why American graphs are always the ones that are being shown rather than Asia, rather than Southern Europe, where trends have started to already emerge. And this is just such a maddening, dementing conversation.
America is where we have the data. We have the data. If you look at a map of where the thermometers were in 1900, it's heavily concentrated in the US. The whole idea that there's a global warming crisis, but it missed the US where we have the thermometers, I'm not buying that at all.
This is exactly analogous to the joke about the man who's looking for his key. And he's looking under the lamp because that's where the light is, even though that's not where he dropped his keys.
So,
we expect to see the trend in Asia. We expect to see the trend in Southern Europe. Yes, you've got more weather stations in places where we don't expect to see the trend. Well, guess what? They don't show yet.
Wait a minute. Why don't we expect to see warming in North America? Why wouldn't we expect to see that? It's global warming. Why not? It's where we have the data. This is this whole fake invisible catastrophes. We don't have the data that shows that there's a crisis, but in places where we don't have the data, that's where the crisis is. Like there's a problem in the Great Barrier Reef. You and I are not going to go check out to see if there really is a problem. It's the whole Patrick Moore thing with the fake invisible crises. Because as we all look around, if we look at real data from anywhere, there's no crisis anywhere. But we have to believe somewhere else where we don't really have the data. That's where the crisis is. But let's talk about, is there even a crisis right now? Is there, are we experiencing
you're introducing unspoken assumptions about the degree of crisis right now, which is not where we started. We can come on to that. But the point is that if you're going to take what is modeled as what's going to happen in the future, and then you're going to say, well, we don't accept any of that unless you can point to me what's happening right now. Well, the thing is, the climate models that you disparage so much.
I do.
Yeah, absolutely. I understand. Predict that the earlier signs of climate change show up in certain regions of the world, and that they make themselves known, that the poles will warm more radically than the rest of the world, and so on and so on. And those models predict more early warming in certain places, such as Asia and Southern Europe and the Middle East and so on, and not in North America and Northern Europe. So that's what the models predict. So you can say, but surely if there's global warming, it should be happening everywhere. Well, that's not what the predictions say. So if we're going by what the science actually says, rather than the clown cartoon version that looks good to an echo chamber, shall we say, then we have to be specific. And you can say, well, maybe the measurement stations are better in another place. Well, that's a problem then, because all they're saying at the moment is what we would expect to see given what the models are predicting. Who is saying that what you're seeing there is different to what the model's saying? You're saying that, but I don't see that reflected in what the models are actually predicting. And this is the problem of how we talk about this stuff. We ignore what the actual, and the other side ignores this as well, because they fixate on doomism, and they will cherry pick the doomist papers, and there's a certain number of names attached to those papers that are the only scientists that they pay attention to. That's their problem. But your problem is that you're asking questions that were never in line with what the predictions are actually about. Making demands about, well, where is there a catastrophe today? Who said that there was going to be a catastrophe today in North America? Who said that?
A lot of people are saying there's a catastrophe right now. We're getting that from the media. We're getting it that there's we're living in the crisis right now, and people are exposed to that. But let's talk about the model saying that Antarctica should warm faster than the rest of the world. That is absolutely not happening. The models are wrong. Antarctica is not warming faster than the rest of the world. For long periods of time, it hasn't been warming at all. So the whole idea that there's a crisis, but it's skipping North America and it's skipping Central England, where we have the longest instrumental record that we have anywhere, and it's also skipping Antarctica. I think you dismissed the medieval warm period because you think that wasn't global. Like, can't we dismiss this because this isn't global either? And another point I'd like to make is that if the models are right, we've been emitting CO2 for a long time. We've run this experiment, and CO2 has gone up from maybe 280 to maybe a little over 420. We've run this experiment, so then now we can see it's been going on for hundreds of years. We can see whether it's right. Are we getting accelerated warming because of this? And no, we're not. We're seeing all sorts of fluctuations in temperature, even within that period when we allegedly raised it from 280 to 420. So we were running the experiment, and we're not finding out that the narrative is bearing out in reality. It's not happening.
Okay, so there was a lot in all of that.
There was.
And before I come on to it, let me draw the distinction again between what some journalists say and what the scientific literature says, because we can agree. Again, one of the things we can agree on is journalists often catastrophize in ways that, when you look at the reports that they're reporting on, often aren't even backed up by the reports. Sometimes they are, because there are some scientists who tend towards the catastrophism, the Potsdam Institute and so on. You will often find attached to the tipping point type papers and so on. But very often the headlines are journalists, and particularly even headline writers, maybe not even the journalists who wrote the story, who are trying to get clicks for advertising. This is one of the challenges of that medium. We might agree on that, but we won't agree.
Hold on. Let me just say one thing. It's a very important point that you just made that we agree on. That's a huge point that we both agree on, that what is said in the media very often, the headlines in the media are very often way more alarming than what's in the science. That's a huge point of agreement. That might be our biggest point of agreement. Yeah.
Yes.
Fantastic.
But the challenge is when you don't draw any distinction. If people who understand or believe, depending on your point of view, that climate change is a thing, if you treat them as one amorphous mass, so you're lumping in the mainstream of climate scientists with those headline writers, that's when I have a problem. Because, of course, when we have polarization, what each side does is that they see the other side as an amorphous mass, and they take the worst of the other side and assume that that is representative of that side. So people will look at your side and they'll find the most extreme, and they will assume that's what all of you believe. In the same way, you can look at the other side and look at Extinction Rebellion, and of course you put them front and center in the movie, and I don't blame you for that, of course. And you say, this is what that side looks like. And of course, it's just simply not true on either case. I don't associate with either side, but you would paint me as being on the other side because I have the essential qualification that my understanding of the science at the moment is that human-caused climate change is happening, and that some policy response is appropriate. What policy response we could discuss. So that would be enough to put me on that side. Of course, the other side, the Extinction Rebellion, they assumed that I was being paid by big oil because I was criticizing them. So that's one of the things that you get when you specialize in pissing off both sides. But that's what I do.
Yeah. So I want to make a distinction. You talk as if just Extinction Rebellion is saying crazy stuff. And you mentioned the whole global boiling thing, and I actually looked up a few of those things. You said literally nobody is saying that the planet is actually going to boil. And we both know that the UN chief, Guterres, said the era of global boiling has arrived. So
yes,
that's
but
completely
we know.
crazy.
Come on, Tom. Come on, Tom.
Yeah.
I think that was a stupid thing for him to say.
100% stupid.
We know that he didn't say that because he literally thought the oceans were going to reach 100 degrees C. I mean, it was an analogy. It was an attempt to use evocative language. It was stupid. We can call it stupid, but he didn't literally believe that the planet was boiling.
Let's go on to James Hansen, right? The father of climate science. He said that you can get to a situation where just the oceans will begin to boil. He actually said that, and I think he seriously was believing that at some point the oceans would boil. He said it more than once. And then Stephen Hawking said that Trump's action on climate could push Earth over the brink to become like Venus, with a temperature of 250 degrees and raining sulfuric acid. The LA Times talked also about boiling the oceans. So this rhetoric is so crazy, and it's not coming just from Extinction Rebellion. What do you say to that?
So there was a short period of time where certain climate scientists had put forward the idea of runaway climate change, which is where the Venus thing comes from. Very quickly, the mainstream climate community said, no, that isn't a thing. That is not, the factors that would make that happen simply do not exist. And it went away. So you can pluck out what someone who was not a climate scientist, I mean, Hawking was a genius, but like many geniuses who fish outside their pool of expertise, the opinions that they get on outside of their pool of expertise are the same as everyone else's opinions to some extent. He may have, I don't know the exact context behind the quote, so anything that I say is speculative on that, but there was a period of time when that had briefly been said. So if he picked it up because that's what he took on trust to be true, well, fine, all of us can be wrong about things. My understanding is that the mainstream climate science community is very clear that runaway climate change isn't the thing that's going to happen. A few people have said it for sure. It's not just Extinction Rebellion who can be wrong. At the end of the day, there is a spectrum of things that people believe might happen, some of which are well supported, some of which are more speculative. As you said, there are things in the complex climate system that we don't know exactly how this starts to unfold. The difference is between whether you see uncertainty as an argument for complacency or whether you see it as a traditional corporate risk manager would see it as an area for heightened risk. Because if there's things that you don't know about, those things represent a good risk, a bad risk for you until you do know about them. And it seems to me that what you're saying is, oh, well, if we can't explain what happened with the medieval warm period, then we don't need to do anything about what's happening today, which seems to me to be there's a clause in that argument I would want to discuss at greater length anyway. But even just on its face, that proposition seems to me to be a remarkable call for complacency, to say, if we don't know, then we should do nothing as a starting point. I find that a remarkable logic if we don't know, that is a case to really feel that we need to know more, surely, not just as an argument for doing nothing.
I'm happy to know more, but then there's all these crazy things that we should give up meat and eat the bugs and live in 15-minute cities and glue ourselves to stuff and never fly again. All this completely crazy stuff to try to prevent bad weather in the future, with this whole assumption that the weather has gotten worse. Cyclones are worse now and droughts are worse. There's all these assumptions that are wrong. We've been emitting CO2 all this time, and none of that, the bad stuff is happening. There's no evidence. Do you think that there is evidence that the warming since 1975 has made our lives worse?
I'm just slightly taken aback because of your reference to eating the bugs and 15-minute cities.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think someone's telling you to eat bugs?
I mean, we're hearing that. We're seeing that in the media, that we might have to eat bugs to prevent bad weather. We're seeing that. Are you not seeing that? I'm seeing it.
Okay. So you're saying that we see in the media
Yep.
scare stories about climate, and those are definitely not true. And you're seeing in other media that somebody out there is going to force you to eat bugs, but you're choosing to believe that. Why?
Why am I choosing to believe it? I'm just saying it's in the media. It's in the media that we have to give up meat. We got to have a meat-free Monday at schools to prevent bad weather. We shouldn't be eating the cheeseburgers. There's people that feel guilty when they eat a cheeseburger. You see that on Twitter. Do you feel guilty if you eat a cheeseburger?
Yeah, but that's different. That's a whole. We can have that discussion. I suspect we would agree on that as well, actually, to be fair. But your specific thing. So the eating bugs and the 15-minute cities thing. This is one of the areas where I think we are becoming detached from what's actually happening in the world because we are so bunkered into our sides. The 15-minute city thing was some relatively boring, possibly bad, possibly good town planning, which got blown up out of all proportion by people who decided to project onto this that this was climate lockdowns. And it was just such nonsense. Because it didn't reflect what anybody on the ground actually thought they were doing. It was projected onto it as this sort of extremely cartoon version of how the world works. The same that all this idea that Klaus Schwab is going to force you to eat bugs. Yeah, all of that from relatively sober discussions about how one of the more efficient ways of producing protein is going to be through insects. So I know someone who's running a startup company where they're going to be producing pet food produced with an insect company that is able to produce high quality protein from a feed that is a waste, in another context. So you're taking waste, you're turning it into high quality protein. No one's suggesting you should eat it. But nevertheless, because somebody's doing that, that then gets turned into, oh, Klaus Schwab is going to force you to eat the bugs. Isn't it a strange level to be having this sort of discussion at? Can't we look at what people are actually doing and have nuanced discussion about what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, without turning it into this, Klaus is going to be taking over the world, the globalists have got their tax on our lawns and all of that sort of stuff?
So, I mean, are you suggesting that no one out there, there's no Bill Gates type out there that would like to restrict our travel, maybe some sort of a carbon credit system where we can only travel a certain amount of time per year, a certain number of flights per year, or a certain number of clothes? We can buy like three new pieces of clothing. There's actually a document that talks about getting rid of flying, and we can't buy too many clothes, and we can't eat too much meat. And there's all these types of ways to restrict our freedom. Are you suggesting that no one is planning anything like that? And as far out in the future, we can all fly as much as we want, eat as much meat as we want, turn up our thermostat. There's no restrictions on our freedom being planned for us in the name of climate change? Because I'm seeing tons of proposals about this. If no one is proposing any of this, then I'm happier than I was.
Okay. So there were two things, and you glided effortlessly from one to the other. You were saying is there nobody out there thinking like this? Of course, there are people out there thinking like this. There are people out there thinking like all sorts of things, including that the WEF is a global conspiracy to subjugate the world. There are people out there thinking all sorts of things. But then you glided straight from that to people out there planning this for us, which is then exactly sort of fitting into, oh, well, there's these people out there. No, there is no conspiracy out there planning this stuff for us. There is a debate. So this may be another point of agreement. So let's see if we can just nudge our way onto this before we get to the next point of disagreement. Because we talked about the science and the politics being different. And the politics, my starting point on all of this is if we need to move towards a net zero position, which is the suggestion that we do, and we can debate about how quickly that can logically be done, because my position is that you should move there as fast as possible, but no further, no faster. And the no faster is how fast can you move there whilst protecting all of the things that we value, maintaining the economy, of maintaining the wealth of society, all of those things. It probably means that you're moving a bit slower than a lot of people would like to think that we could move. That's a different discussion. Nevertheless, you still get to make choices within that of how you go about it. So some of the times we look at certain things and we say, well, these things are absolutely essential to who we are. So therefore, how can we reduce the impact of those things? But then there are other things that people look at, some people look at, and they say, here are things that we personally moralize about. And therefore, we believe that the answer to those things isn't to reduce the impact of those things, but to get people to change their behavior so they don't use those things. So hence we get the whole debate about should we be eating meat, should we be flying? And the frustration that the journalists often go straight from the issue of climate change to meat eating, the issue of climate change to flying. They do it, the BBC does this at the drop of a hat, because that's how their journalists think about these issues. And we could agree that that is a leap. I would say that travel, and I've always said on my channel, right from the earliest stages, that I am in favor of travel, that the ability to go to different places in the world is a miracle and one of the things that we should highly value. You broaden the mind, you learn your place in the world a lot better when you can travel to see it. And therefore, we should treat that as a good that is of high value. And therefore, the exam question is how do we reduce and eventually remove the impact of that? And that's a hard one. It's a hard problem to solve. But nevertheless, human beings have been pretty good at solving hard problems. It just comes down to what you set yourself as the problem to solve. And that is much more feasible than telling everyone they've got to give up flying. And I don't believe for 2 seconds that Bill Gates has said that you need to give up flying. I've never heard him say that.
Okay.
But again, these things get projected onto people with this sort of cartoon version of the bogeymen that we're deciding to identify for whatever reason we think it's a good idea to do that.
Okay, so maybe you don't know about the C40 cities document. I'm looking at it right now. It's an official document of mayors. This is the things they want to do to prevent climate change. It's a long document. It's completely freaking insane. And I think you might even agree with me when you look at this thing. It's not journalists saying that they're saying, I'm looking at it right now, their progressive target for us. They have consumption interventions for food for us. Their progressive target, 16 kilograms of meat per year per person. Their ambitious target written right here, 0 kilograms of meat for you per year. That's what they want to do to prevent bad weather. Same with dairy. By 2030, these people want you to have consumed 0 kilograms of dairy per year. Do you agree it's insane?
Okay, I would
crazy stuff.
I would need to see that and understand where it's come from, because unfortunately, I can't take as a reliable narrator either side of this polarized discourse. As you've described it there, it sounds highly unfeasible that anyone would vote for it or implement it. because this is one of the things, ultimately, if it's so crazy, then who do you think is going to implement it and who's going to vote for it? And the answer again and again, of course, is that where these issues do get to be particularly difficult and burdensome, then the trade-offs become politically extremely awkward. And this is one reason why, I so rejected what you put in the movie about how the politics of this work, that politicians were jumping on climate with glee because here was an issue they could use. I've watched for decades politicians doing nothing but kicking the can down the road because they didn't want to take responsibility for difficult decisions in the early stages when they could get away with putting it off. And that is generally what they've been doing. Now, we got to a point where the world's politicians started to think, we are now starting to see the consequences. We actually can't get away with putting this off any longer. But they still don't necessarily want to take the things that are actually going to be the least popular and the things that will get your side the most hot under the collar, and deservedly so, and probably me a bit hot under the collar as well when I come across the BBC going on yet again about banning meat and all this kind of stuff. Nevertheless, by and large, that's not what politicians are queuing up to do, because why would they? In order to solve a problem that's going to mostly be about the future, and they get no credit for avoiding the problem because nobody really believes that it's a problem if they don't see it bearing down on them, and yet the costs and the consequences are immediate. Why, as a politician, would you see that as an attractive thing that you would want to jump onto?
Some politicians clearly do see it as an attractive thing, posing as someone who is saving human civilization. So they can make the grand promises now. They just don't want to be around when we actually have to do all this crazy stuff in order to try to meet their targets. So there was Obama saying, I think in 2008, that this is the moment when the rise of the oceans began to slow. Like if we elect him, we're going to be able to control global sea levels. And of course, Gore, you can still call him a politician maybe in 2000 and whatever, 6 or 7, when he was posing as the guy who's saving us all. So people do like to pose. They like to think of themselves as world saviors. So there is something about that, but they don't want to be around when the pain hits. You talked about this, right? And I agree. We have an invisible future benefit with a current visible cost. So nobody wants the pain of going through all of these crazy C40 cities types of things. People do want to pose as the saviors of the world. And by the way, I just emailed you. Hold on. I emailed you a link to the C40 cities thing in case you think I'm not telling you the truth, so you can pull it up yourself. And I am.
I'm not accusing you of making the whole thing up. I was just saying. But let me say something about the politics of what you just said, because there's something interesting in there as well. I do think that what we've seen with the polarization, particularly in America, but it's not, and if everything that starts in America flows outwards from there, sadly, is the political polarization there has led to an increase in ideology on both sides in terms of how much radical action for ideological reasons the extremes are pushing for. Now, in the UK, I think we've generally had the luxury of a system that pushes our political parties to the centre. I'm a centrist. I'm in the soggy middle. Generally, I recognise the benefits of capitalism and that it's been the best system for us. I also recognise some of the downsides. I think we need to have a fairly pragmatic approach to what works and what doesn't. So, when it comes to UK elections, I look to whoever is within sight of the centre ground and who is competent. And if I've got a choice with that, then I'm very happy. Very often, our elections have been one obviously competent and one obviously incompetent, which is less than ideal. Now, the American system, I think, has rather in recent decades started to fall because the gridlock of its government means that you no longer have that many consequences for electing a government. We elect a government, they're in charge. So whatever they do, they then have to answer for at the next election. Whereas your system with gridlock, you can always try and get stuff through, the other side stops you, and you can blame the other side. And what happens in that situation is there's no cost and consequence to your base drifting further to the extremes. Because when you get elected, you get blocked from doing the extreme things anyway. So you can be as extreme as you want to feed your base. But ultimately, you can point at the other side as an excuse as to why you weren't able to deliver. And in many ways, we've seen that on the left in the US. You know, certainly Biden, who promised to govern as a centrist, was, you know, clearly much more influenced by his radical base and has done a few things, but by and large, you know, the gridlock prevents anything absolutely major happening. And on the other side, you know, you had Trump last time, whose policy agenda wasn't that extreme anyway. You know, it was more the nature of the personality of a man. Whether that's going to hold with a second Trump term, you know, we can only wait and see. But nevertheless, when he's feeding the base, he's feeding it with, you know, as much red meat as he can throw to them, and that then terrifies the other side. And so it is on a downward spiral sort of thing. Clearly, people who are feeding the ideological base will say certain things now and will put certain propositions forward now. But I see a difference between those who are governing with power to actually govern and what they believe that they can actually do before they lose the support of their own people. You know, wherever you get governments and they've forgotten that, you've gotten backlash and you've gotten pushback. And we've seen some of that in Europe with the agricultural policy stuff that they had in Europe, clearly had stepped several steps beyond the pace or even the sensible targets that you should actually be aiming at. And they have reaped a backlash, which is a good thing because it forces you to get better. I've been talking for a long time. I should stop there and let you come in.
Very good. All right. I want to talk about your position as a centrist. You have, and maybe now you're working in the field of sustainability, right? Helping companies with, I think you said on a different podcast, maybe half of your work had something to do with helping companies meet their climate commitments, something about climate. I'm just wondering, do you see yourself as someone who approached Climate the movie when you were ready to watch it with a completely open mind and you were open to the idea that there is no problem with CO2 causing a crisis or anything, a completely open mind, or did you have any preconceptions going in?
Okay, so there's two things in there. I've done a lot of work with businesses over the last 20 years, largely because they are pragmatic entities that are interested in what works, what doesn't work, and how they can make it profitable. And as a pragmatist by nature, I dabbled with politics in my early 20s, discovered very quickly that's not where pragmatists live, and then ended up working with businesses who were trying to understand and navigate what were the changing expectations on them. And if you put it that way, then it's a reasonable proposition that is about the changing expectations on business. So there are certain businesses that have got supply chains that are already showing visible challenges from the effects of climate change on their businesses. And there are many others that see it in the pipeline and many others who see changing expectations on them in terms of what the societies that they're operating within expect of them as good corporate citizens. And you don't have to go into the field of woke businesses where you are implanting ideology at the heart of a business. There are some businesses that do that, like Ben and Jerry's and all those kind of things, where the ideology has become part of what they do, and you can justifiably point at them and describe them as woke and say that they've kind of lost their anchor. That was never what I was doing. I was talking about how you run successful businesses in a changing world where the expectations on businesses are changing. So that's one thing. Put that to one side. Did I go into watching your movie with a completely open mind? Well, I go into any operation where I'm seeking to evaluate something with a view of how effectively is it making its case, and how persuasive is it? Because I had two possible stories I was going to tell about this. I didn't think I was going to come away saying, wow, these people have come up with a novel theory that I didn't know about before about climate change, or a novel take on an existing theory about climate change that has completely transformed how I see the world. That's asking a lot of one piece of content. I wasn't projecting that onto my expectations, but I was going in to say, how good a case is it going to make? How many times are we going to agree? Because we have agreed in the course of this discussion on a number of things, and I can entirely conceive of how one would do a skeptically flavored piece of content that there would be much more agreement in. So I didn't go in necessarily with preconceptions about how much I was or wasn't going to agree or disagree. I knew that you had some of the usual faces in there, and I knew that stuff that I'd seen associated with them in the past had not been particularly persuasive, but I didn't know whether or not this piece of content was going to surpass what I'd seen in the past. And if it had, then I would have said so. This is why I did a blow by blow breakdown. Every claim that's being made, is this a valid claim? Is there a supposition behind the claim that we should actually talk about? Because sometimes there were hidden suppositions, straw men that were being put forward for you to knock down. And I wanted to identify those before then talking about the claim itself. A lot of talk about what life was like for the dinosaurs. Well, you have to start with a supposition that is relevant to our situation today and what the argument is as to why, before the factualness of that becomes even a thing that you need to talk about. So yeah, I would say that I was open to whatever you put in front of me. If it was validly based and the evidence supported it, I would have given it a tick, as I did with the polar bears video, as I did at least 2 out of 3 ticks with the Great Barrier Reef video that I did, looking at some of the arguments around that. When I see cases that the evidence supports what they do, yes, I say this seems valid. And if I don't know, I'll say I don't know, because again, my position is I'm interested in what's true, not whether it supports a pre-existing position or not.
Okay. So about our movie that we worked hard on, and that we sincerely think we're doing the best we can to present the truth as we see it. You said the movie, quote, spends all its time making truly garbage statements about the science of climate, end quote. Do you want to back off on that at all? Or do you think we really spent all 80 minutes making truly garbage statements about it?
I'm afraid I do, yes. I use words relatively carefully. Having gone through on a blow-by-blow basis, I don't see, if you can't put up a graph showing what's happening in Southern Europe and Asia, as well as North America, as well as everywhere else, if you can't show all the data and then give me a version of what's going on that stands up in front of all the data, not just these very, very carefully selected, truncated bits, then yeah, I'm afraid I'm going to be extremely rude about that, because it's not good practice. If I have an argument that I want to make, I want to test that argument in front of all of the available evidence, because otherwise you're just inviting yourself and your audience to kid themselves. And one of the things I see your group doing and Extinction Rebellion doing in a totally different way is picking out certain things and then repeating them over and over and over. And of course, with repetition, you start to, the size of the truth becomes bigger and bigger the more it's repeated. But it's only a partial representation of what's actually happening in the world. And if your political position and if your scientific opinion is robust, it should be able to withstand all of the evidence. And of course, what your group ends up doing is dismissing half of the evidence, saying, oh, well, climate scientists are cooking the books. which is a very convenient get out of jail free card to say where the evidence doesn't support our position, then we're going to say that it's faked.
So you're claiming that there's long-running temperature stations, there's long records elsewhere in the world that do show something alarming happening with the climate. I'm not aware of those. I would like to see those. I want to see these mythical mythical data records showing that there is something happening in like Central Asia. You really think there's records that go back maybe to the 1700s or something, and they show something, say, correlation with CO2 and temperature? I don't think those exist. I've been involved in this debate for close to 20 years, and I've never seen them. Do they exist?
You're suddenly putting a whole bunch of additional criteria onto evidence that it's now got to go back to 1750.
Well, that's why we use Central England, is because it's our longest running temperature record. If there is a signal, it should show up there. You're saying because of some reason, we let's throw that out. I think the reason you want to throw it out is because it doesn't agree with
that is exactly an example of garbage science, because again, we are back to the thing. The models say that we don't expect to see that trend appearing in Central England.
Wait a minute, they say that? The models say we don't expect to see global warming in Central England? That's what they say? I've never seen that either. They say we shouldn't see it in Central Park or North America?
Not in extreme terms. It's that we expect to see certain things happening more. So if we have an event that happens once every 100 years and we now expect to see it once every 10 years, obviously you don't get to see that on a day-to-day basis. That unfolds over a period of time. We expect to see certain measures of mild warming in the early stages, as indeed the record shows, as indeed you acknowledge, and particularly with nighttime temperatures and so on. But in terms of where we're expecting to see those trends more writ large, then it is the areas like Africa, like Southern Europe and so on. I showed a graph of the Southern Europe. There was a clear trend there. So the point is always showing Central England and always showing the contiguous United States, when clearly these are not representative of the whole world, is indeed garbage science. Now, if you're going to make claims, then you have to contain them within what we can know. So nobody is saying that we can show with exact granularity what was happening across Africa in 1750 because the measurements weren't there. But the idea that if we weren't there, somehow it doesn't exist is not a very helpful place to start. We need to step back from the rhetoric and say, what can we know? What do we expect to see where? If we're expecting to see a trend in Southern Europe and we're seeing that trend, can we take that as information without having to say, well, it doesn't count if we can't follow it all the way back to 1750 or 2000 BC or whatever you decide is the barrier this week? You know, it's a nonsense way to talk about an issue. We can only go by the evidence we've got. We have now got an increasing amount of evidence, but from your side, we only ever see the same graphs over and over again, usually with an underpinning assumption that gets introduced and not talked about. So if we're talking about drought, and yet we don't look at graphs about drought, we get graphs about temperatures, and you're thinking, hang on a moment, I thought we were talking about drought. We do have that data. Yeah, all of these little tricks that get played, yes, I look at those and I say, maybe there is a case to be made here. It is not being done justice to by this manipulation and misuse of data. And particularly when you've got graphs that the end bit where you see the warming has been missed out. I mean, come on, really?
What graph are you talking about?
So there was
like Central England?
No, there was.
While looking that up, let me read something else that you said. You said that emitting CO2 is, quote, like adding steroids to the weather. And you also said climate change is making heat waves in India 100 times more likely. So what evidence do we have that heat waves in India are 100 times more likely now than they ever have been? I think these are absolutely garbage statements that you've made, and I need you to back those up.
Where did I say that?
I will provide you with the, I don't know, I have it right here. It's definitely a quote from you. Climate change is making heat waves in India 100 times more likely, within quotes. You don't believe that? Because you did say that.
So I generally consider myself to be more of an expert on what I
Okay.
believe and what I've said than other people. I
Did
get
you
lots of
say
people
that
telling
climate
me,
change or that emitting CO2 is, quote, like adding steroids to the weather? Do you deny saying that one?
I seem to recall quoting somebody who said that. So I believe there was a context for those,
Okay. What was
because
it?
those are not my words.
Okay. And you don't believe those
But
words?
those are not my words, and I don't remember, but I do remember they do ring a bell. So I think I was quoting somebody, and I need to know what you're quoting in context there, Tom, to be honest.
But you don't believe those. Do you believe those now?
I don't have an opinion on, so I don't have the data in front of me
Okay.
about how much more likely something is to happen in India. So if I genuinely said something in relation to that, I need to see the context, because it's not something I would have just been expressing an opinion about. That's not the sort of thing. There's all sorts of things you could be quoting back at me, and I'll be saying, "Yep, I remember saying that. Yep, I remember saying that," and I will defend all of them. What you
Okay.
said there were either I was quoting something else and it was in a context, or I didn't say it.
Okay.
I don't know which, because I have no idea what it is that you're quoting back at me.
Fair enough. So I have one more follow-up question. Why would climate models say that we are expecting alarming warming in Africa, but not in central England and not in the US? Why would they say that? And what data does tell us that there is alarming warming going on in Africa? How fast is it warming? Where is it? What's the data?
So, first of all, we do know from the models that the changes will happen differently across the world. We have a complex climate. We know the poles are going to warm faster.
Except Antarctica is not warming faster, right? That's absolutely not happening. What you think is happening, it's not. Antarctica is not warming faster. So right there, that is a huge problem if we're going to trust the models, if they think Antarctica is going to be warming faster, because it's not.
Let's come back to that in a second. But what I'm saying is that we know that certain places are warming faster and are expected to warm faster over the coming period than other places. And that comes down to how climate works and the existing systems and how heat gets transferred around the world via currents and air movements of air and all of that side. So we do, and there are people on your side who will also acknowledge that, for instance, the poles are expected to warm faster and are using that, in some of their arguments, and those are some of the better arguments that are out there in terms of the impacts that are likely to be felt. Why would you think that the impacts would be delivered in an identical way across the whole globe? Because the Earth gets different amounts of solar insolation depending on the cycle it is, depending on the seasons. Clearly, there are going to be differences in how this works. We've got the polar vortex that can be strengthened or weakened, and when it's weakened, then you can get blasts of cold air intruding across various places. All sorts of these factors that have the increase of energy coming into the globe affects how all of that plays out, is a cascading sequence of consequences that are quite unintuitive sometimes. If a polar vortex strength weakens, then we might get more blasts of cold air, and then you get people on your side holding up snowballs saying, "Ha!" and they say it's global warming. All of those things are complexities about how this actually works. Why would you insist that it has to be simple, or else somehow it fails your test?
I am absolutely not insisting that. Climate is not simple. I don't know who's saying that, but it's not me. I've never said climate is simple. It's incredibly complex.
So why isn't it not possible then that the climate models would show that certain areas will see the signs of warming earlier?
I think it's possible, but I'm asking what evidence? We've been emitting CO2 for 200 years. What's the actual evidence that that is happening? It's possible. I don't think Africa can continue to warm faster than everywhere else forever. That can't happen. At some point, there's got to be some regression to the mean. At what point do you think that the North America is going to start warming alarmingly? If it's not now, when should it?
Okay, so this is the jump that we make then. So from the discussion about how this plays out in the future to the discussion about that's all very well, but what's happening right now today?
Right.
And this is, of course, is one of the things that I criticize in the movie, because you make this jump, and it's a very convenient jump, because if the majority of the impacts that we expect to see are in the future, but of course, what people respond most viscerally to is what they see in front of their eyes and what they feel and experience today, then pointing at areas where things are relatively normal and saying, oh, look at this, an example of climate catastrophe. It's just a cheap trick, really. The few areas where we have started to see changes, we have started to see increases in certain extreme weather events, but of course we haven't seen changes in others, and some are not predicted. You talked about tropical storms, hurricanes. The IPCC does not predict that we will expect to see more tropical storms or hurricanes, although it does predict that they would start to get more powerful. So of course, you end up saying, well, there's no more tropical storms or hurricanes. And you've even quoted someone in the movie saying even the IPCC admits that that's not going to happen, as though they're somehow shamefully admitting something they don't want to admit.
Here's something funny.
They're just saying what the science is. The science is we're not expecting that. And you're saying climate change can't be true because we're not seeing that.
Here's something funny. I really enjoyed this whole admits thing, because you said, oh, we use the word admit, and that's not a word you should be using because it's kind of projecting on other people that that we don't trust them or something. But right after that, you said that we admitted. You used that word, you put it right back on us, that you used the word admit against us. So you did exactly the thing that you said that we were being kind of nefarious or something for using.
What was the context?
Within a 2-minute period in one of your things.
Because it may have depended on there's got to be a context there. If I made my own mistake, I'll hold my hands up, but I need to know exactly what it was I said.
Okay, I have the entire context here. You said Will Happer said the IPCC admits it. And you said notice for framing, they admitted. It's not that they know it. They openly stated in the report, because what the research says, they admit it, hinting that they really wish it wasn't that way, but that they'll grudgingly accept reality. I suppose it pushed to do so by heroic doubters and skeptics. This is the framing that you're being sold here. The IPCC says we don't expect more hurricanes. The data shows we're not seeing. Then right after that, you said the movie has admitted that the planet might just be warming. So right after that, within 2 minutes, you said there's some sort of nefariousness about Will Happer saying admit. But then right after that, by mistake, you said that we, the filmmakers, admit it. So this is something that people do. You criticized us for doing something, and then right after that, you did exactly the same thing. People do that. I make mistakes too, but you did that in your debunking. You did it.
Okay, so I think let me contextualize why I said that there, because what I was responding to was one piece of content.
Yep.
And my understanding, which you've now told me is incorrect, which I absolutely accept. My understanding was, at the start of the movie, you said one of the reasons why this is happening is that there's no warming. And
who said that? There's no. Wait a minute. Hold on.
No.
We said there's no warming. We never said there's no warming. Never.
Well,
no, we did not say that.
You didn't use those exact words.
Nope. We didn't. No. We don't.
Let me finish what I'm saying.
Okay.
Let me finish what I'm saying, because what I said to you early on in this conversation was that when you were talking about the Central England record, I had interpreted that as saying practically no warming worth speaking about. Then you showed the Central Park thing, no warming.
Since the 1940s.
I took that as you saying there was no warming.
Nope.
You said that wasn't the intention, and I accept that.
Okay.
So I was responding to having taken that your first argument was that there was no warming, and then the next argument was, well, yes, there's warming, but my saying they now admit was in reference back to that early stage. So, if that had been right, that you were saying, first of all, there's no warming, and if there is, then it's not us, that would have been entirely a valid comment, so they now admit it. But what you're actually saying is, well, no, I was wrong to take your first showings of those graphs as saying that you were implying that there was no warming. I think implying that there was barely any warming was certainly the strong emphasis that I got, but I'm happy to take your intent as the way that you said it.
Okay. All right. Let's see. We're at the 90-minute mark. Do you want to cover some more? I can go either way, whatever you want to do. I think this has been really valuable to talk this stuff over. I think we
I mean,
have found it. Yeah.
Let's keep going for a little
Okay.
and see if we can wrap it up with smiles and hugs.
That sounds great. One thing I wanted to ask is what has been the worst thing that has happened since 1975 because of the warming in your view? Maybe you think that there hasn't been a lot of things yet, but in the future, it sounds like in the future you're worried about bad things happening. But do you think they're happening right now? Really bad things happening globally right now because of the warming since 1975?
So you're trying to project a certainty onto me that I have no interest in having.
Okay.
Of course, there have been all sorts of bad climate events over the recent decade or two.
Yep. Weather events, right?
And
don't you mean weather events?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And of course, all of them are terrible and they affect real people
Yep.
in serious ways. Now, whenever I've been talking about those sorts of things on my channel, and I don't very often, but whenever I have, I've said, of course, there is no evidence that this specific thing necessarily comes because of human-caused climate change. However, we expect these to happen more often as a result. That is the equation that I hold to. I have been generally pretty skeptical of the climate attribution unit that has been trying to get to the point where they can jump on very quickly to any event and then come up with a pronouncement that says this was made 40% more likely because of human-caused climate change, or this would never have happened without human-caused climate change. I'm not saying that they may not be true, but I suspect the methodology is not yet enough robust to have the weight hanging on it that they project.
Okay.
But that is my gut instinct based on partially the political intent behind what they're doing, and also the fact that there are a number of mainstream scientists who I have seen raising eyebrows at, some of the issues around the methodology. Not saying that it has no validity, but saying that maybe it shouldn't be being projected with such certainty in the way that it is. So I tend to stay right away from that. There are some, there's been a pretty brutal heat wave across Asia over the last month or so. And I feel for the people that are experiencing that. I'm also extremely aware that some of the areas there have been, very close to areas that are beyond the tolerable limit for humans, and in areas where there's a lot of poverty and a lot of people who don't have the benefit of air conditioning and all of that. And I would rather be thinking about, assuming we think that's going to happen more, what can be done to adapt for people who don't live in cities, that for who are not going to have that air conditioning, so that this is not going to be so brutal for them, rather than using it as a thing to point out and say, there you go, see, climate change, because that's not the discussion I'm that interested in having.
Okay, I think we're agreeing again then that I don't think the solution,
no.
even if we think that heat waves are going to get worse, which I don't think we have evidence that they have gotten worse, but even if we think that, should we try to prevent the heat waves somehow, or should we adapt to it and make sure that they have a reliable power sources, maybe even coal-fired plants or something? They need to adapt by having air conditioning somehow. And the whole idea that they should run their air conditioners on wind turbines and solar panels. I mean, we shouldn't even talk about the green energy thing. Probably that's a whole other thing. But adaptation is important. Yeah.
Let's dive into
okay.
that.
All right.
Because we have no fear in this discussion.
Let's do it.
So, first of all, I think if you look at all of the different areas, if you look at the data, there are trends in relation to heat waves.
Well, what are those trends? Because like where we have the data in the US, the heat waves in the 1930s were way worse. That's where we have the data.
Yeah,
if but this is data from elsewhere showing the heat waves getting worse. Tell me where that data is. I want to see that data.
I showed one graph for Southern Europe in one of my videos responding to so there's one.
So that's one.
There are similar trends in parts of particularly Southeast Asia. But yeah,
how long?
North America, Tom, North America is not the world. I mean, I don't know how many
Southern
times I
Asia
can
is
say
not the
this.
world. Southern Asia is not the world. You should know that
No,
by now.
absolutely. But it is where we expect to see the trends first.
We expect to see
That's the
heat waves
point.
there, but we
This is
don't
why you
expect to see
don't
heat
look
waves.
under the where the street lamp is. You look where you think you've dropped the keys. You look to the places where you expect to see it first. However, let's go on to the energy side,
Okay.
because this is interesting. So I agree that the evidence shows that the production of CO2 is something that we should avoid, and we need to undergo an energy transition to cleaner forms of energy. Now, it seems to me that if you're looking at that as an engineering problem, rather than with all the ideology that's sloshing around this discussion, you'd be looking at a mix of reliable, always-on energy like nuclear, alongside other forms. The mix is probably going to vary depending which country you're in and which strengths and weaknesses that country has as a result. And in the transition period, clearly fossil fuels, on even the most optimistic projections of how quickly you could do this, short of the Extinction Rebellion fantasy stuff, like the Climate Change Committee in the UK that created a model that suggested that it could be done by 2050. That's the most optimistic projection. That's the earliest date that we've seen that has any kind of rationale behind it. Even with that, fossil fuels continue to play a key role whilst you're in that process of transition, if you are doing all the things you should do, keeping reliable energy supply, keeping it cheap enough for people to use, and all of those things that we would agree should be a requirement for a modern day energy supply. And of course, if you're in developing countries where increasing the amount of energy that you use is key to that development, then they need to get solutions that are going to give them what they need first and foremost. And obviously, people like Michael Schellenberger are pointed at examples where inappropriate solutions were adopted, because they were renewable solutions and so on, and they did not meet the criteria for what they actually needed. And we would agree that that was a mismatch. And we could debate about what one should do in those situations. I can't believe that that's an insolvable problem. But of course, all of these things are insolvable when you get ideology into the mix. The challenge is that we've got a whole bunch of people who, for reasons that I find utterly baffling, think that we have to have 100% renewables, 100% solar and wind power, and some one or two other bits and pieces. Now, my understanding is that that will be really difficult, if not impossible, to make work, for all the reasons that you and I would know about the variable power sources and so on. And if they think that it can be done, then, as always, I'm open to understanding what it is they know that I don't. Show it, prove it, show how it would work and why that is better than the alternatives, which would have a slab of nuclear in it, as far as I can see. And so far, I haven't seen any evidence to suggest that the people who ideologically believe that it must be all renewable have done the work to actually show that that can work, or even that it should work. But then, the same goes on the other side, because if you have the luxury of saying, oh, well, of course, fossil fuels are just wonderful and they have no consequences on anything, then of course they make perfect sense to use. They're a very, very valuable energy source. Human race would not have gone through the miracle of the Industrial Revolution without it. Very dense, portable power source, brilliant. Except, of course, that we do now know that it has these consequences. So the solving of the problem that we need to do is, how do we give up some of those advantages on a managed time frame so that we can compensate for what we're losing by building in the capacity we need to make up the difference? And that should be an engineering problem. And we should probably have to accept it's not going to happen by 2050. Maybe China's right to say that it's aiming for 2060. Maybe it's going to take longer than that. But of course, the challenge with you saying that is you don't want it to happen at all.
I'm not
And
saying that.
people
I'm
will
saying
hear,
we don't want to run. I don't want my state to, I don't want people telling Minnesota, you have to run this state on wind and solar, and that's it. Because enormous amounts of people will die. They would actually die if we actually tried that crazy experiment. So I'm totally fine with nuclear power. I think that's probably going to be the long-term way to go. I think we have a lot of agreement on energy here that we need reliable baseload energy. I was going to ask you about, should we, I think it's crazy to ban the internal combustion engine by 2030, or bureaucrats thinking they're going to prevent bad weather by forcing us all into electric cars. And that somehow is going to provide a payback in reduced bad weather. Do you agree that banning internal combustion engines anytime soon is crazy?
so I'm going to ignore the campaign phrase, because the forcing people into cars to prevent bad weather, that's campaign language.
Okay, I'll rephrase it and rephrase it in
I understand what you meant.
whatever.
I'm just noting the campaign language as we do. Let's talk about that. I am relatively agnostic to the policy choices that different groups make, in that if they get it right, then it will work and they will take people with them. If they get it wrong, I'm interested to see how it goes wrong and how people respond against. So I understand why some governments have decided that the way of forcing the pace of innovation is to set a deadline. Because after all, we did that in a much easier way when we saw the issue with the hole in the ozone layer, and governments agreed worldwide to ban CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, on a time scale. So to tell business and industry, this is going to be banned at this point in the future. You've got this period to innovate and to come up with your alternatives. And that relatively worked. I know there are some within your audience who will probably think that none of that ever happened and so on.
Well, just as an aside here, the whole idea that CFCs are the ozone hole control knob, I think that is absolutely not proven, but go on.
I would expect nothing else of you, Tom. But the point is, as a policy vehicle, that idea of pre-announcing a ban in order to force innovation, you can understand why that sometimes works. So there's this thing that right now is really useful, but we've got this problem with it, whether you accept it or not. That's the policy position. There's this problem with it, and therefore we're going to announce a ban in the future to give time to create alternatives so that we don't immediately lose the usefulness of this thing. So you could argue that when it comes to the use of the internal combustion engine for personal mobility and transport, something that we highly value, that is an appropriate policy device to use. Now, would I personally have set it on the challenging time frame that they have? I was surprised when in the UK, Boris Johnson said that we should ban the petrol engine by, now was it 2030 when he said it, or 2035? I forget. I think it was 2030, but it was nudged back to 2035. It seemed remarkably ambitious, particularly from a Conservative Prime Minister. The thing with Boris was that he announced lots of big things and then didn't behave in the slightest in the way that you would have to make those things happen. So all of those targets were set and then they were eventually pushed back. And for me, that is just incredibly bad policy making, because all of the businesses will tell you that what they want is certainty. The motor manufacturers minded less when they were given a firm deadline than they did when they were given a deadline, and then 2 years later it was changed, and then 3 years later it's changed back again, because what the hell are they going to plan on that basis? So I think you and I would probably agree that the quality of political decision making in this area has been extremely poor, regardless of which side of the fence you sit on, because ultimately we have seen knee-jerk policy decisions being made. We've seen people setting targets without a clear view of how you would get there. I think people underestimating how much needs to be done in order to get where we think we're going. And all of those things I think we would agree on. The only difference is that I believe we need an opposition to those clumsy, lazy politicians who have the credibility of agreeing where we need to go, but are absolutely going to hold their feet to the flame for the complete mess that they're making, the complete lack of accountability there is for how fast they think we can go there and what's going to get broken on the way. And unfortunately, your group, because it basically says there is no problem, there's nothing to see here,
Right,
doesn't carry with it the credibility to be that opposition. And this is why I think we have a real democratic problem. We've got extremes who are becoming more and more detached from reality, I think, with the Extinction Rebellions, who are wallowing in doomism and genuinely thinking that, the planet is going to be finished in 10 years. And the other side repeating to itself over and over again the things that persuade it's all just these crazy alarmists and there's no evidence at all of anything happening. And then in the middle, you've got a group of people who are not challenging because they think that they've all got to be in campaign mode to make this thing happen. So you've got an opposition in the UK that hasn't been challenging the government, except by saying you should go further and you should go faster. One of the things that the Global Warming Policy Foundation did that I support, I think possibly the only thing that they've done that I support, was that they went through the numbers of the Climate Change Committee and challenged some of the maths that they'd used behind their assumptions. And I don't know if they were right. I don't know if they were wrong in how they'd interpreted the numbers, but I thought, yes, this is what we need opposition to do, to challenge, to hold to account, to say, hang on a moment, we're looking at your homework and we think that you fudged some of these numbers. That's what we're missing. Unfortunately, because it was them that did it, by and large, newspapers weren't reporting it and so on, because they didn't see them as having any credibility. And we can probably agree that possibly should have gotten more coverage in spite of that, but nevertheless, we are where we are.
So I would push back at this whole idea that people like me who don't believe that human activity is the main cause of climate change, that we're some sort of a fringe group or way out on the fringes. Because I don't know if you just saw this Monmouth poll that just came out. They asked Americans, what do you think about this issue? And 34% of them, only 34%, saw human activity as the main cause of climate change. That means 66% didn't even buy into that much of it. I think there's a big awakening happening right now in recent years where people are not believing experts. They're not blindly trusting the experts anymore. They've been lied to over and over, big time, by the media and by the alleged experts. And then they're not trusting the experts anymore. You can definitely see this shift. There's podcasters like Joe Rogan and you see on Tucker Carlson and on Jordan Peterson and all elsewhere, maybe even Russell Brand, that people are questioning the experts. And when the climate change thing comes up now, they're starting to scoff at it. There's some movement away from the alarmism. I'm for sure seeing that. I know there's people that have dug in and they've dedicated their lives to this and they're going to take this to their grave. But I think the normal people, the actual voters, they are absolutely not going to take any decrement in their lifestyle. They're not going to pay more than a tiny amount of money for this thing because they're not believing in it. And I think even the people who say they believe in it, they're not willing to not fly or change their lifestyle in any way. Almost nobody can be bothered to behave as if they truly believe in this. So do you have any comment on this about the general idea that the public is all in on net zero? I think bureaucrats are, but the public, they're not in on this. And I don't think they ever are because the evidence is so flimsy.
So that's exactly the interpretation of the data that I would expect you to take.
Yeah, it is the correct interpretation.
And of course, the other side, as soon as there's a little drift the other way, they overread into that as well. The general public, by and large, I mean, I saw the polls you're talking about. There was not that much movement from year to year. I
Like
think they've been a certain
17%
way,
among
they've
young
drifted a
people.
certain way, they drifted back a certain way. There's a couple of things here. One is that the general public, by and large, respond to what they see in front of them and what they are most immediately worried about.
Yes.
This was always the challenge with climate change because, from most of the time that I've ever been aware of it, it was theoretical, invisible, and in the future. And
Right.
what people will always worry more about is, recession today or potential war or, whatever it is that's happening right in front of us that is very visible and feels like a real threat. People will always be that way. That is the way that people respond to the world as they see it around them. Now, the groups who I would contend are slightly detached from reality always filter all of these signs through the things that they want to see. And when they see the things that they don't want to see, they attribute it to the madness of the other side. And so you can look at these polls and you can go either way. You can decide, well, if it's going against you, it's because of all the leftists in the schools who are poisoning the minds of our children, and you can deal with it that way. If it's going the other way, you can say, oh, well, the people are waking up from a madness and they're coming around to our way of thinking. And neither of those are particularly true. People drift a little way this way. If there was a big climate event that strikes close to home,
A weather event. You're
bit the
talking
other
about a
way.
weather event, right? It's not a climate event. It's a weather event, right?
But it comes down to how people understand it. So you all want to make that fine distinction. But the point is, people started first to worry about this stuff when they started to see weather events that they believed were outside of the norm of what they're used to seeing. And when that happens from time to time, and we expect it to keep happening, then you will start to see, there'll be more people in that middle who become a bit more concerned about it. And when that hasn't happened in their universe for a while, they'll become a bit less worried about it and so on.
But those events have happened throughout human history. Those events have happened throughout human history. Every single year, as far as we know, there's been bad weather. If you read in history, people are always stunned by what just happened. They've never seen this happen before. So the whole idea that bad weather is any indicator that CO2 causes bad weather, it's not. But sorry to interrupt. Go on.
No, but I wasn't making that argument. I was saying that when people see climate weather events that they believe to be outside the norm, then they will drift a little bit more to being concerned about climate change. That is a reaction of the masses. That's not about what you would say about what that event does or doesn't signify. So in terms of what the polls are showing, I think you're being extraordinarily optimistic if you think that it reflects people are waking up to our way of thinking. I don't think it shows that at all. I do think that in America, particularly, the growing polarization and the fact this issue has emerged in the political mainstream, in that you've got Trump and on one side now, who is very firmly in your camp, that has brought the issue more, the polarization around the issue, more into the mainstream of your average voter. And so it's become a little bit more associated with how you identify yourself in the world. So if you identify yourself as a conservative in the time of George H.W. Bush, that didn't mean that you necessarily had a particular opinion on climate change or not, because it wasn't a party political issue. Post Al Gore, and I blame him for this, it started to become a party political issue. And now with Trump, of course, that has very much certainly made it very visible, because you've got the Democrats who have gone one way, and then Trump is drill, baby, drill, very clear choice. And I think the movement of the issue from the scientific one, where you would look at evidence, to one where what you think depends on how you see your political identity, that is the shift that's happened in America that I think probably you would expect to see, therefore, more of a rise in skepticism amongst the wider population. But what you're actually seeing is the filtering of that scientific issue, alleged scientific issue, into how people are understanding identity politics. Small not the liberal identity politics, their version, but generally how people perceive themselves in the world. I mean, I don't know. That is my pure supposition based on how politics is playing out in America and how you would expect that then to play out in how people think of themselves. But I do think that's probably as easily the explainer for what you're seeing in those polls as what you hope it would be.
Okay, so your prediction is, as that time goes on, people will wake up to your side. They'll see, oh no, the weather is getting worse, and the polls will show that they're shifting to your side because the weather just keeps getting worse, and now we believe that CO2 must be causing the weather to get worse. That's what you're predicting is going to happen? Because I'm predicting that's not going to happen.
Again, I don't have a side.
Okay.
So my understanding of what the science predicts is going to happen is that we would see signs over the coming decades that will make it clearer and clearer. Now, what does that mean in terms of a general population? I have made no predictions in relation to that because aggregate human behavior is quite an interesting thing. When we first started to see a few weather events that people did worry about, which I think was around about the time of Al Gore's wretched movie, The Inconvenient Truth.
Wait a minute. You're saying that the people weren't worried about weather events before that?
There was, I recall that there were a couple of things that happened that got a little wave of concern, certainly across the UK, but I believe it was wider than that. And there was a little bump up in terms of people being worried about the issue. And then over time, that sort of gradually goes back down again. And it seems to me that aggregate human behavior is dependent on a number of things. One is uncertainty and fear of the unknown. But then also, when something emerges into view, what might happen is that people become clear that, yes, this is definitely happening. But because they're now seeing it, it is a known rather than an unknown. It may actually make them less anxious about it. And you just don't know. I don't know exactly what's going to happen over the coming decades and how that's going to play out in world populations. What I think we are going to see is that the split between the North and the South populations is going to be exacerbated because the South are now telling themselves the story that climate change is being done to them by the North. They don't have the resource to deal with the consequences on their populations, and the North is going to be only giving them token support for that, let's be clear. And so I think what you could find is that climate change becomes an ongoing real problem for us as the world, but not necessarily because, or even just not just because of the actual climatic events, but also because of the divisions that then become solidified around it, around world populations. There's a lot of other things to do with that. Does China become dominant over America or vice versa? So many geopolitical things in play that affect how all of those things happen. But predicting how the population is going to be thinking about these issues over the next few decades, that's not something I would ever try to do.
So if we were to experience a period of rapid natural global cooling, do you think that would be good for us, A? And if not, do you think we should try to emit CO2 and to try to prevent that climate change by trying to artificially heat it up to try to maintain a stable temperature? Is there anything humans can do to maintain a stable temperature, or is it going to continue to fluctuate regardless of what we do?
So, there's so many things wrapped up in that. Clearly, we don't expect to see a period where we suddenly get cooling.
Are you ruling it out?
Let me put it to you this way. If you were to ask me the question, what would it take to persuade you that human-caused global warming was not happening? There would be a couple of things. One would be a competing theory that matches the multiple sources of evidence at least as well or better, which they don't currently. And or secondly, an extended period of time where the globe demonstrably is cooling, where we can rule out some rogue actor. So there's one thing we know that we could do to cool the planet, which is what's described as geoengineering, injecting particulates into the stratosphere, which some people want to study, and other people are saying under no circumstances should you even study that. I wouldn't, given the interesting characters we have, and some of whom are billionaires, I wouldn't rule out, because it's not technically that difficult, that somebody might not take it upon themselves to decide to save the planet in spite of not being asked to by anybody, to actually do something like that, to say, better to ask forgiveness than permission. Let's go and shove a bunch of this shit into the stratosphere, and lo and behold, we'll have bought the planet a couple of years, and then we can do it again because everyone will recognize that we were right to do it. So if the world suddenly started cooling and we didn't know why, my first question would be, hang on a moment, we need to know why. And this is the thing, you can tell me we don't know why we had the medieval warm period. We don't know for sure whether it was regional or global and all of those sorts of things. But what we do have now is much better evidence about causes and effects that we can see in front of us. We don't know what happened then because we don't have all the measurements that we do today. So if we suddenly got cooling today, it seems to me we would be able to find out much more quickly and much more reliably what was driving that change. And so if it turned out to be something that completely turned on the head of everything that we've believed that we knew about climate, that would be fascinating. I would be the first to be wanting to know all of the detail of that. But no, I'm not expecting that to happen.
Okay. Would it be good? I don't know if you answered that part of it. Would that make the weather better if the Earth were to cool by, let's say, 0.5 degrees C? Because we're led to believe that the last 0.5 degree C has made the weather worse. That cooling back down, would that make the weather better? Less droughts, less floods, etc.?
We are led to believe is a phrase in that sentence that's doing a lot of work. So
I'll rephrase it if you want. Yeah.
My understanding is the challenge that we have is rapid change. Now, this whole thing about, well, how warm should it be, how cold should it be, is utterly irrelevant to me. If we stopped today artificially changing the climate, so it's stabilizes a word that will trigger you, I know, because the climate is never stable. But in terms of the energy balance, that stopped being changed artificially by us today, which is not going to happen, obviously. But supposing that happened today, are we at a bad place? We are where we are, and there are certain consequences that will feed through that will have bad consequences for some people, and they will have to adapt. But because then we don't have ongoing and increasingly rapid change, then that's a project that you would do and you would adapt to the situation that you're in. The problem we have is that we are feeding the change, and the change will get faster. And then that starts to have cascading consequences. You asked me if I believed in tipping points. The challenge with tipping points, of course, is that we can know that some of them exist, and we can posit the existence of others, but what we simply do not have is any kind of certainty about where you cross the line. And so that uncertainty is definitely not a cause for complacency, but the majority of the mainstream climate science that I read suggests that likewise those who are particularly triggered by this and believe that we are literally cascading over the edge of all these tipping points and we're onto this downward spiral, they do not believe that that is merited by the evidence of history and what we see in the world today. So whilst recognizing that these things exist and we would rather not go sailing over them, doesn't mean to say that you have to be a doomist who believes that we're about to.
So how rapid do you think this current climate change is. We're told that it's rapid, but compared to what? Like over the last 30 or 50 years, how rapid has the climate change been? And how do we know that humans have not experienced hundreds or thousands of other periods over the last 200,000 years? There's a lot of sliding 30-year periods. How do we know how fast the climate was changing on a 30-year period 10,000 years ago or 1,000 years ago? How do we know that?
I suppose my question is, why do you feel you need to know that before deciding what needs to be done in the face of what we're actually facing? Because it seems to me there are certain discussions that turn into how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. And this whole thing about, if you look back into the past, there's bad weather in the past, and that means that what's happening today must be normal. That is a ridiculous on its face argument. It's like saying human beings have always died of natural causes. So this person with a knife sticking out their back must have died of natural causes.
So you think bad weather is evidence that CO2 causes bad weather? What we need to know is it outside what we've seen in the past? Is it warming faster than we've seen in the past? We don't know that.
CO2,
we're told that we know it must be humans because it's so fast, because it happened so slow in the past. But that's made up. That's garbage science. Completely made up.
But it's only garbage science because you create a straw man out of it, saying, oh, CO2 causes bad weather. Weather is caused by many different factors. What we have is a changing element, which is the amount of CO2 and therefore global warming, which then changes the way that all the other parameters are interacting together. So things that used to reliably happen in one place, like the monsoon in India, for instance.
Did they ever reliably happen, though? Do we have evidence that there was reliable last 1,000 years? We could set our clocks by when it happened? No.
Not according to the clock. But the point is that when there was unreliability, it was a problem for human societies. And if we're going to artificially create that, exacerbate that unreliability, that's a problem.
How do we know that the weather is any more unreliable now than it ever has been in the past? How do we know that? Maybe it's more reliable now. We don't know. It's unpredictable. How do we know this?
That is a bold statement on its face.
It's a question. How do we know?
Ultimately, all you can do is look at the multiple factors that we can measure and that we can look at, and we can model on how this plays out over time. Okay. And we can talk about the consequences and how, as Kissinger recognized in 1974, the fact that we have filled the planet with, approaching 10 billion amazing human beings, and that we are now very dependent on a number of breadbasket areas. If we were being rational, we would say that puts us at some risk to the sort of variability that used to devastate societies at various points in the past.
So the whole idea...
We therefore have an interest in taking seriously how the changes that we're bringing about are likely to play out. And taking that seriously is a rational thing. Whereas looking in the past and saying, well, the climate always changes, and that's an argument for complacency and doing nothing. That is a very strange argument, because in the face of uncertainty, complacency is almost never the rational response, it seems to me.
I mean, this whole idea that adding additional CO2 in the atmosphere is going to cause lower crop yields is crazy. It's completely crazy. The Earth has been greening. NASA admits that the Earth has been greening because CO2, I know you don't like it. They do admit that CO2
grudgingly through clenched teeth.
CO2 is plant food. People add additional CO2 in greenhouses. They pay to add additional CO2 because it makes the plants grow better. I know you're going to talk about C3 versus C4, but if you look at our world in data, the yields just keep going up. The whole idea that, oh no, the crops are going to fail because there's more CO2 in the air, that is not what's happening. That does not make any sense. Longer growing seasons and more CO2 out there, that helps our crops to grow. There are lots of other reasons why yields are going up, but the whole idea that, oh no, we need less CO2 in the air, that's going to be good for our crops, that doesn't make any sense. There's no scientific backing for it.
I haven't heard anyone put it exactly like that.
Well, you're kind of suggesting let's worry about our crops because maybe 420 ppm CO2 is bad for crops. Are you not saying that? You're thinking, are you agreeing with me that it's probably good for crops?
No, let's disentangle this, because obviously it's important. First of all, it is a good thing, obviously, that the yield of various crops has been going up, and that has largely been down to increasing use of land for agricultural production, and the improvement of agricultural techniques being used, particularly in developing countries. And there's a certain amount, we're running out of some of those benefits in terms of, we're very close to the edge of how much useful agricultural land that we can actually utilize.
Actually, there's an enormous.
But nevertheless, there's lots of space left for improving agricultural techniques. There is still some space to go on that. The challenge is not that CO2 is bad for the crops, but that the consequences of global warming can be bad for crops. What we are used to is that we've had a number of breadbasket areas, and that we generally see that there's one or two bad weather events or changes that will impact on one of them, or maybe two of them in any given year. And in spite of that, because the risk is well distributed, we manage to produce the crops that we need as a planet and distribute. And the growth of the population, the human population, is slowing down. So, and is expected to slow down, and that's going to give us other problems, but at least it means that we know that, at least we've got some sort of stability around the amount of crop that we need to feed the number of people that we have. However, if we create more instability with climate events, then the likelihood goes up that you get several major events taking out breadbasket regions happening at the same time. And the challenge of that is that it doesn't happen until the year when it happens. This year we've had one or two of those, and of course we've had another event taking out another breadbasket, which is the war in Ukraine, nothing to do with the climate. Of course, this is one of the other challenges. Sometimes these breadbaskets get taken out for totally other reasons, and that just then leaves you slightly more exposed to climate events or weather events. So it is a rational, risk-based concern that you don't just look at the line on a graph that's going upwards. You say, what is underpinning that improvement? Can you just draw a continuing line and think that that's the way that it's always going to go? Well, not unless you've analyzed what that growth was created by and what are the factors that's going to affect that growth in the future. But, the straight line fallacy that says if a line on a graph is going one way, it's going to carry on going that way. We know, of course, that often doesn't happen. I've seen people's country GDP going up and up, and then you find out, well, some of that was from unsustainable deforestation, and suddenly it goes down again. At one point, it looked like it was incredibly healthy, but you've got to analyze what is underpinning that continued increase. And this is the challenge. It is a risk discussion. Complacency in the face of it isn't something they felt that they should do in 1974. Since then, we've added billions more humans and more strain on some of those breadbasket areas. And let's hope together that that never turns into a crisis that we have to face. But it isn't irrational to say increased destabilization of the climate produces potential for real problems in that area.
Yep, I completely disagree. There's no evidence whatsoever that CO2 causes increased destabilization of the climate. There's no evidence of that at all. Another thing about the arable land is that when I was talking about crop yields, that is on a per acre or per unit area. It's not because we're farming more land, that's why. I'm talking about crop yields per unit of area, and those are going up. And I completely disagree that we're, by the way, on the edge of farming all the arable land on Earth. I think I've heard you say that elsewhere. I think there's just tons of arable land still that we're not farming. We have golf courses. We got all sorts of stuff going on. We're not farming. We're in the U.S. We're paying people not to put to farms in some places, the soil bank and et cetera. There's a lot of arable land left in Africa that we're not farming. So anyway, the idea that we're going to go hungry because of additional CO2, I reject that 100%.
Okay, but so there's a discussion about the amount of arable land, and the equation differs depending on the countries. But of course, sure, if you're going to convert all your golf courses and rip up all sorts of other things, but
Well, we're not
that's
going to
not
do
what
that
anyone's,
because
that's not what anyone's
yeah,
proposing
we're
to
not doing
do.
that.
So
But if we had to, we could. We could grow stuff in greenhouses. Blah blah blah. Yeah.
the other thing you need to also acknowledge when you're looking at this equation is that even when you're looking at the studies of how various crops respond to increased CO2 enrichment, there is a trade-off point where increases in temperature start then to offset the improvements in the growth of plants just because of CO2 enrichment. And so, of course, if you believe that, well, that doesn't matter because global warming isn't a thing, well, fine. But if for the rest of us,
no one is
recognize
saying that global warming isn't a thing. I haven't heard
but
that.
if for the rest of us, we recognize that, yes, as CO2 increases, then the planet will get warmer, then there is a trade-off point where the benefits that you're getting at one level get traded off. And of course, this is in those areas that are not experiencing the extremes. So, in Southern Europe, for example, we had over the last 2 summers extremely difficult times with heat waves and drought and fires. And that resulted in, of course, lots of crop damage. And likewise in India last year, Gujarat area around there, they had massive unseasonal floods that destroyed lots of crops. So, of course, it's not just about, oh, yeah, if the weather stays broadly the same, but there's a bit more CO2, everything will go great. That's not the issue. The issue really is that when you do get those extreme events, then very often, if they coincide with an area that's a breadbasket, a huge amount can be taken out by those events. And we just don't want to see multiple ones taking out zones at the same time.
I think it's pretty clear that warming from here, even a degree or 2 degrees warming from here, would increase the amount of arable land. You could farm in places in Canada where you can't farm now because the growing season is too short. So cold is the enemy of farming in general, and warmth is good for farming. And the whole idea that global cooling, if we want to go back to the Little Ice Age, because that would be good for farmers, no, it wouldn't. That would be very bad for farmers.
You say that, but then that's great for people in Canada.
Yep.
And yeah, absolutely. We should take the benefits. I live in a place now where they're growing wine again, and I'm happy with that. We'll take.
You like warm weather, right? Yeah.
Which is all very well, but if you live on the equator and you've been making a success barely with agriculture there in the face of a relatively tough, arid climate, that extra degree of warming is not going to be your friend in the same way that it is for those people in Canada. And it's all very well to sit back and say, as a world, we will be fine because we'll be able to do this in Canada. But people don't live in the world. They live in particular locations, in particular countries. And when you say, well, it's all very well, of course we can adapt. What that has looked like through history was people being forced to migrate. And the people who say we should adapt are often not overly keen in some of the consequences when they turn into mass movements of people around the world. So let's just be clear about, no, this doesn't play out the same in all of these different places. Yes, lovely for Canada. Yes, pretty good if you're in the UK, to be honest, at least for now. But many parts of the world, that's not the equation, but a little bit of extra warmth means for them. Let's just be clear about that.
Are you clear about the fact that your models that you like say that the warming near the equator should be moderate compared to much more warming further away from the equator? So we could have a warmer world where the tropics don't warm very much, but Canada, where we want the warming, that does warm more. That's what's supposed to be happening. It's not supposed to warm more where it's really hot at the equator.
Well, it's interesting that with all of the evidence that we have about the different ways that this will play out, if you choose to fixate on only the bits that you think tell good news, and you ignore the bits that would be extremely difficult for people and for the planet generally, for species and so on, that is a choice that you make. And I think that, whilst, as I said, recognizing and celebrating the areas where there will be benefits and bonuses, I still think that on a solid risk management basis, it makes sense to be clear-sighted about what's happening and what the real consequences of that are going to be. And I don't see why you wouldn't frame your public policy going forwards on that sort of looking at the whole rather than just the bits that you want to see.
Isn't there an enormous amount of framing of public policy, though, looking at just the bad things? Like in Minnesota, we're constantly told that we don't want warming in Minnesota because it would be harder to play hockey outdoors on the hockey rinks. That's like the most important thing ever is outdoor hockey. We're not talking about how we could play a lot more golf and we could do a lot more construction and farming would be better. Huge advantages to warming here. No, we're fixated on it's outdoor hockey. That's the worst thing ever. And we have to we have to pay enormous amounts of money and give up our freedom, blah, 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 because of outdoor hockey. You agree, right? That there's enormous amounts of propaganda fixated on just what bad thing could be caused by warming. Maybe we're going to get kidney stones. I've seen that over and over. It's going to be so warm, we're going to get kidney stones. And Dave Collins says, okay, I live near a lake. The temperature varies 1 or 2 degrees, depending on how close you are to the lake. Do we have data that shows you get more kidney stones if you live in a slightly warmer place near the lake? Yeah, it's all baloney, of course. You got to agree with that. The kidney stone thing, come on.
So I think we would agree that there's a lot of nonsense out there. Standing back from this and just looking at this, almost as an anthropologist might, there's clear causes and effects for this, because what people who end up saying some of that nonsense, how they got there, it seems to me, and this isn't justifying it, you should be responsible for what you're saying and so on, which is why they will criticize me just as much when I say this to them. But they got to there because for them, it's all part of a campaign. Mm-hmm. They are trying to motivate decision makers to take the actions that they believe, and the evidence does suggest that we need to take in order to abate climate change. And their worry is that anything that's presented as positive will be jumped on by people like you to say, there you go, see, we don't need to do anything because of this good thing. And what they're saying is, no, look at this bad thing. And this is entirely understandable. These are the campaign positions and where each of them take you. So it has led them into going on and on and on about ridiculous stuff and always focusing on the bads. And yes, always talking about the deaths from heat and never talking about the fewer deaths from cold and so on. The thing is that if we could agree that yes, there are good and there are bad, and we can nevertheless look at it and say, and yet therefore we still need to do this, then probably a lot of that stupidity wouldn't be happening. But because we're in this clown cartoon version of this, where heat good versus cold bad, people are ready to jump onto any old. When I put nuance into some of the videos that I'm talking about, there will always be people in the discussion forums jumping onto them saying, aha, you said this, therefore. And it's just like, yes, I understand why these people end up only ever wanting to talk about the bad things because of this stupidity. Nevertheless, if you say stupid things, even if that's how you got there, you still have to be responsible for what you're saying and whether it's true or not, and whether you're scaring people unnecessarily and all of those things. We would absolutely agree on that. So I don't think there's many evil people in this discussion. I don't think there's evil people on your side. I don't think there's evil people on Extinction Rebellion side. I think there are evil things that are done occasionally, and that should be called out whenever it happens. Nevertheless, I do wish that we could get this discussion onto the center ground where nuance is something that we're allowed to have, and we don't have to talk in these shades of black and white. And that really, I guess, is the whole message from the last 2.5 hours of this discussion, which I suspect we probably need to bring to a close.
That sounds great. I'm glad you said it first, because I was ready to say that too. So yeah, this has been a great discussion. I think we have exchanged some nuance, right? We've agreed on quite a few things, disagreed on things. I think it's been very healthy to talk about this. Thank you for taking the time. And
well, likewise, I think this, whether people think this was a good discussion or a bad discussion, I think it's different to an echo chamber discussion, and it's also different to an artificial debate where you've just got people battering each other with their positions.
Yeah.
I think we've explored each other's views and just probed a little bit about how we got there and what's underpinning them in a very creative and engaging way. So hopefully other people will think so as well.
Okay. All right. I think I'm done talking. Thank you very much. And maybe we can do this again. We'll talk it over. Thank you, Mallen Baker.
All right, Tom, thank you very much.
Goodbye.